Donald Trump did not quite make it to 1,000 days in office before the House of Representatives began an impeachment inquiry against Donald Trump. And now, 1,054 days into the Trump presidency, the House of Representatives has put it in writing. He betrayed the nation. He is a threat to national security and the Constitution, and he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office. All of that appears in writing now on this 1,054th day of the Trump presidency in articles of impeachment. Most days in the lives of members of the House of Representatives and the United States Senate are a blur of business as usual, rushing from one meeting to another, attending hearings not exciting enough for television, squeezing in some time for campaign fundraising so that they can continue to hold a job, where they can only occasionally feel themselves contributing anything that actually helps move the government in a better direction. Most days in the lives of members of Congress won't make it into their memoirs, but every once in a very great while, sometimes only once in a generation, there comes a day when it's all about the oath.
The president's oath of office appears to mean very little to him, but the articles put forward today will give us a chance to show that we will defend the Constitution and that our oath means something to us.
House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerrold Nadler signed his name to House Resolution 755 submitted to the House of Representatives, quote, impeaching Donald John Trump, President of the United States, for high crimes and misdemeanors. The articles of impeachment summarize the case against President Trump in just over 8 pages. There are 2 articles of impeachment. Article 1 is abuse of power. Article 2 is obstruction of Congress. Article 1 says Donald J. Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in that, using the powers of his high office, President Trump solicited the interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, in the 2020 United States presidential election. He thus ignored and injured the interests of the nation. He has persisted in openly and corruptly urging and soliciting Ukraine to undertake investigations for his personal political benefit. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous invitations of foreign interference in United States elections. In all of this, President Trump abused the powers of the presidency by ignoring and injuring national security and other vital national interests to obtain an improper personal political benefit. He has also betrayed the nation by abusing his high office to enlist a foreign power in corrupting democratic elections. President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office. And Article 2, obstruction of Congress, says Donald J. Trump has directed the unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of subpoenas issued by the House of Representatives pursuant to its sole power of impeachment. President Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in a manner offensive to and subversive of the Constitution, and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to the exercise of the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. In the history of the Republic, no president has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry or sought to obstruct and impede so comprehensively the ability of the House of Representatives to investigate high crimes and misdemeanors. President Trump has acted in a manner contrary to his trust as president and subversive of constitutional government, to the great prejudice of the cause of law and justice, and to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office. And each article of impeachment ends with the same sentence. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor trust, or profit under the United States. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.